Since discovering my asexuality and taking literal years to work out exactly where on the spectrum that I sit, it has been my mission to find more and connect with more people like myself. Now, of course, I rarely get out of the house, so I've had to resort to finding those people in books instead. For me, a lot of books based around asexuality have allowed me to learn more things about myself, my experiences, and how I am interacting with the world. They have been a big eye-opener and a big contributor for my asexual identity, discovery, and coming out. So it has taken me a while to find them over the past 3-4 years when I started reading them back in 2021. But I am here just in time for the internationally recognized Pride Month to talk about the ace books that I have read thus far. Let's see how I, an aspec person, rate books that I have read featuring asexual representation. There are 7 books in this list that feature asexual characters in a prevalent way. They are either the very main character or they're in like the top 5 most important characters. I think most of these are main characters, however. I will be talking about these books in the order that I have read them, and I will be discussing why or why not these books have good asexual or aspec representation. Beyond the Black Door by A.M. Strickland was the first book that I read that had asexual rep in it. When I was first looking into finding asexual books, I wanted those with protagonists in a fantasy setting, considering those were the kind of books that I most often read, and I wasn't all that enthused about looking them in a contemporary perspective. That is an assumption that I ended up dropping later on. So I got an asexual fantasy book, and I really liked it. What I really liked about Beyond the Black Door was how it explained a lot of things on a spectrum for any person who identifies as queer. A moon-based religion in this world explains identity and attraction being on a spectrum with an XY axis sort of thing going on. This form of identity covers 4 spectrums: what gender you identify as, what gender you're attracted to, how much romantic attraction that you experience, and how much sexual attraction that you experience. We explore the identities on this spectrum of more individuals, but we're just going to be talking about the protagonist, Kamai, who is the asexual protagonist in question and the main source of representation I'd like to talk about for this particular book. There was a lot about Kamai's asexual experience that we ended up exploring. We explored her repulsiveness to sex, which is not an experience that I personally have, but it was a very validating sort of thing at the time for me to still read, to uncover what she was and wasn't comfortable with in terms of sexual activities and even certain romantic activities. We explored the allosexual expectations with her family's business surrounding espionage and the sexual sort of relation to getting information out. And of course, we explored how strongly or not strongly she had attraction to certain people or otherworldly beings. And one key thing I liked here that was also very validating for me to read at the time was that she did end up having a little bit of a romantic fling going on. I particularly like this because even though I don't identify as aromantic, Kamai does appear on the aromantic spectrum, and it was good to see a little bit of that in her, that it wasn't just a total asexual, aromantic thing, because it's a very much spectrum experience for people on any kind of spectrum like that. But in spite of that, her arc didn't rely on her getting into a relationship, which I feel like is an experience that some asexual representation has. It was more so to explore her own identity than it was to get with somebody, which overall made the experience very good for somebody who did want to get into a relationship to read and somebody who didn't want to get into a relationship to read as well. Overall, a very validating book for anybody who identifies as asexual, and for somebody who maybe doesn't fall under those spectrums, a good read to get you educated on the ideas of spectrums surrounding aceness and aroness. The Sound of Stars by Alicia Dow. That was the next book that I read that featured an asexual protagonist, but this time the story wasn't about discovering that one was ace or somewhere on the spectrum. The protagonist in this novel, Ellie, identifies as demisexual, meaning that they develop these kinds of attractions after developing a strong connection with that person. So this book does involve and center around a relationship. This could just be me not thinking that her and her romantic partner that I don't remember the name of weren't a good fit, but I don't know, it just didn't feel like authentic sort of demisexual, asexual, aromantic, whatever. It didn't feel like a good representation of those sorts of things. It felt like the demisexual part of her identity was shoved in there. There was nothing about the way that she was particularly acting that felt like it was intrinsic to her identity or intrinsic to being demisexual. As someone whose own identity is very close to demisexuality, though I didn't know at the time of reading this, the way that Ellie fell in love felt so allosexual. It felt like her demisexuality was shoved in there last minute, literally a facet of her identity that was there for 2 sentences and was gone. It didn't feel like that much of a core part of her. The attraction felt there from the start, when typically with demisexual experiences, at least with my own demisexual experiences, you don't get that from the start. It ends up being developed. You know the person, you become like friends with them in a way, and then something just clicks. This is for both romantic and sexual sorts of things, I guess you could say, just to be clear. I know that asexuality and demisexuality can be different for everyone, but this depiction did not relate to my understanding of it in any way. It did not seem to be a facet of the character that was woven in well, and it wasn't something that was particularly discussed in the book either. This didn't have to be a story about Ellie discovering that she was demisexual, but something about her being demi just didn't feel authentic to me, and so I wouldn't rate this a good representation of asexuality. Every Heart Adore by Seanan McGuire features Nancy as the asexual protagonist in this novel. And again, it is not an important part of the plot. She is romantic while being asexual. And there is a particularly key moment in this novel where her own experiences as an asexual are discussed with beings from different worlds. And she's able to have a moment to explain her perceptions around romance, sex, and other relationship-based stuff when she gets a crush on one of the characters. Nancy has a discussion with Sumi over this when Sumi discovers that Nancy has a crush on Cade. Sumi, being a very wild and Mad Hatter personality sort of person, straight up asks Nancy if she wants to fuck Cade. Nancy, of course, explains that she's asexual and that she does not want to have sex with Cade, and that the experiences that the two of them have throughout the book are very interpersonal, romantic sorts of interactions. She also appears to have some sort of romantic connections with a Death Lord from the world that she was once trapped in, though we don't see that explicitly happen as it is in the past, and this is about her recovering from those experiences. This is a description that I was pretty happy with because you could see how her asexuality impacted the sorts of ways that she thought and went about things. While sex was something that she didn't want to do whenever she described a relationship with her Death Lord, touch seemed to be a very prevalent thing, which for some asexuals can be a very sensual thing and maybe one of the things they are most comfortable with doing with a romantic partner of theirs. I do wish this kind of stuff was talked about or explored a little bit more, but the discussion that ended up happening here was very relevant and it ended up explaining a lot about Nancy. So this is a pretty decent example of representation, but I wouldn't call it top tier. This next one, however, is, and is the first contemporary example on this list. Whenever somebody tells you what kind of books about asexuality you should read, Loveless by Alice Oseman is going to be recommended. Loveless features many characters that identify on the ace spectrum, but the main character is Georgia, who at the beginning of the novel starts to consider the fact that she might be asexual when a round of kiss the bottle at a graduation party goes horrifically wrong. She ends up going to university and stumbling into situations and semi-exploring what it means to be asexual before identifying as both asexual and aromantic herself. What makes Loveless stand out above all else is the experiences surrounding heteronorm and allosexual ways of living that Georgia thinks she wants to be a part of, but realizes that she needs to reprioritize things to the ways that her body actually works and the identities that she does have. It covers exploration, asexual programming, queer support networks, acephobia, coming out to your family, and so much more. Even though I don't identify as aromantic like Georgia does, this book made me feel so represented and seen just because of how much of the experiences ended up being covered. There's a reason that this book gets talked about so much in the ace world. And having read it, validated me to no end. It reduced my imposter syndrome regarding my asexuality. That's a pretty good book, and I recommend it to literally anybody, regardless of whether they're on the ace spectrum or not. Survive the Dome. I hated the ace rep in this. The largely forgettable leading female, not even the protagonist, was revealed to be asexual in the very last chapter of the book, and it was in another instance of a shoehorned sentence. I read that sentence, and I giggled to myself, thinking, you're not ace. Her being asexual and whether or not it impacted the story, I don't care about that. The way an asexual can present themselves is very, very irrelevant. I know some very, very flirtatious asexuals. What ticked me off about Survive the Dome's representation of asexuals was just how shoehorned it was. Her mentioning her asexuality did nothing more than just tick a diversity box. That was literally all that happened. She just mentioned in a sentence somewhere, I'm asexual, and it did nothing. It was the faintest tick in the diversity box. If I were to throw the fact that I was asexual in a sentence the way that this character did, who I don't even remember the name of, it would be in a very relevant sort of situation. This was asexual pick-me-girl energy. And besides, there's way more ways to describe somebody as asexual rather than using that term out loud. There's way more ways to show that instead of tell that. Elatsue by Darcy Little Badger was the next book that I read, and I wasn't particularly a fan of the plot, but I was a fan of the way that Elatsue, the main character, also known as Ellie, the second asexual Ellie on this list, I just realized. The way that Ellie was represented was in a way that I very much liked. She is asexual and quite possibly aromantic as well, in a story where that was not the focus. The focus is a murder mystery and she can see ghosts and stuff, and that helps her out with solving the murder mystery. What I liked about this representation was that it wasn't something that Ellie herself revealed. There were some mentions in this third-person perspective that linked to Ellie being asexual, really with her connections with people, and how a lot of the relationships that she has are either familial or platonic. But in light of certain events, it's something that other people reveal and use the actual asexual word. So this is non-closeted representation. In this version, a cousin or a family member of Ellie's asks if she'd like to be a bridesmaid at a wedding, but then she backtracks a little bit and says, I don't know if you would be comfortable with doing something like this because you're asexual. But then Ellie reaffirms that, no, I'm okay with it. This is a depiction of a healthy environment in which people are taking Ellie's sexuality into an account and are trying not to make her feel uncomfortable in an active way. This is more soft representation, but it's still good representation out there. A very much show don't tell version of it too. The final book on this list we're going to talk about is Let's Talk About Love. In this one, our protagonist Alice knows that she is asexual, but it is because of her asexuality that her girlfriend ends up breaking up with her, and it leaves her in a place of doubt that she would ever be able to experience a relationship at all again, just because she doesn't like having sex. Things especially take a turn when she develops a big romantic attraction for her library co-worker. The great part about this representation of Alice is her not being sex repulsed. She doesn't like having sex, but that doesn't mean she won't. She just wants people to be aware of it and comfortable with it. She is also bi-romantic. It's not very often that you see a collision of more than one queer identity in queer-based media, so to have someone hold both of them is very, very good. And we don't see any issues about her being bi in this. This is more so a ace-based story. It also uncovers the difficulties and the things that need to be navigated when getting into a relationship with an asexual person. This is something that I read about just after I navigated it myself, and so much of it made sense to me. I also liked how it described romantic attraction on a scale. Scales are the ways that asexuals such as myself measure a lot of things in our lives. relating to that kind of stuff, so it was good to see more of that kind of stuff coming up, especially from an author who was not an own voices author. She did a lot of research going into this, and it shows. To finish up, I've made some notes about what I have noticed while reading these asexual books. A lot of these books that I have picked up feature female characters as the main asexual. Loveless was the only book that I read that had a non-female, but even so, that non-female was not the main character. This brings me further interest because I've noticed a lot of the books on my TBR that feature an ace character are also female ace characters. I'm wanting now to see more depictions of other genders. I don't know if this means I haven't been looking for them actively or if they don't exist. Considering I want to write a story where the protagonist is non-binary and asexual, this is something that I should probably do a bit more research into. On the plus side, there is a bit of racial diversity with the ace people featured here. The ones where I liked the asexual representations the most were owned voices fiction. I'm not sure if Claire Kahn is asexual, the author of Let's Talk About Love, but she is a queer author, and she described herself as being on a different part of the spectrum than her protagonist Alice. I don't know if that means a different place on the asexual spectrum or just she's on the allosexual spectrum. To be determined. I tried to do research into this and I couldn't quite find out. There is a surprising diversity of ace stories, from coming out to discovering it in yourselves to just living your life while being ace. There are a lot of different stages to working with your own asexuality firsthand. However, I do think more things that need to be discovered in these ace stories need to be being ace while in a relationship and also ace imposter syndrome. I hope you found some great books to pick up from this little list that I have made, and maybe some books to avoid as well for their ace representation. As I mentioned before, as a writer, one of the stories that I am working on and hoping to publish sometime is a fantasy book with a non-binary protagonist discovering that they are asexual. It's going to be the queerest fantasy book that you have ever seen, with very cozy vibes with the way that I have been planning it so far, and I hope you'll be able to stick around for when I'm able to publish that, because asexual books for me have been a big part of me discovering and validating my own identity, and to be able to write a book and eventually publish it is a big goal of mine, just so I can give back that experience to people and have people be able to experience the same things that I have. That euphoria and validation of being ace. Be sure to like this video and subscribe if you want to see more discussions about books or asexuality representation in the future, or just ace experiences in general. That's definitely something I want to do more of on this channel. So I hope you stick around, and I hope you have a great rest of your Pride Month.